Hey there, this is Andrew, and today I'm going to be bringing you something a little different, talking about what dead games are and the history of some different games that have died and how that could relate to KeyForge. And should we be about that happening to KeyForge, and if so, what should we be worried about exactly? So this came up because the last few weeks there have been several conversations that started in Forge Facebook group and even some other places with people worried for various reasons. Oh, well, I read this, I heard that. And I want to just give a quick shout out. Dominic Hurov did a nice little write up about the history of some of these games. And it was interesting reading through his write up there in the Facebook group because he just had a different history than me. Um, I I played Netrunner. I played some Destiny, but he had played some games that I hadn't, and I think wasn't such a big Netrunner player, so definitely filled in some gaps there, and hopefully this will fill in some other gaps. But um, but I wanted to address it in this format and just kind of walk through some of the categories of why games die. So uh, first off, I will start by addressing the question of what it means for a game to be dead. And one theme that I've seen come up in this discussion is people will say, well, if you can play it on your kitchen table, if all you do is play on your kitchen table, it's not dead. And that's a really good point because if you are a person who plays these games just, with a friend casually, then what does it matter to you if no new content comes out, if there's no competitive scene, but you're able to still play it the way you always have, then what does it matter to you? And I think that's a really good point. And I know that FFG Fantasy Flight Games, the publisher of KeyForge, specifically very aware of their kitchen table players. So I think they I'm sure have that in their mind that hey, we don't need this to go on forever for it to be a success and make some people's lives better. However, a lot of us do like the experience of having competitive play, of having a place to go on a regular basis to meet up with other people and play. And we like the experience uh, that high level competition, and then of having a meta that is shifting, and as new content comes out, maybe it pushes the meta in a different direction, and things that weren't viable before are now, and things that were before are less viable now. I love that experience, and a lot of other people do too. Um, So for sure, for a lot of us, if FFG stopped producing new content and if they uh, stopped having a competitive scene, then it would be a loss to us, and it would reduce our interest in the game. Now I'll say we are almost a year into lockdowns, and the KeyForge competitive community has really stepped up and run events online in a way that I think has really helped the game. It's been, I've helped a little and participated in a lot of other people's events, and it's just been fantastic. So we've even seen the meta evolve since new sets have come out, right? So um, even without new content, the meta is not necessarily static because different people are still discovering different things and exploring what is a really good combo in this set. So it's yeah, it's it's been very good. Now, would that continue if there were no new content? That's a great question. Uh, or if we knew, oh, FFG is just never going to do competitive stuff. We've kind of had it in our mind we're going to be able to jump back into this at the end. So that's been kind of a okay, let's just keep everything going until FFG picks up the mantle again. But I think once things start letting up, you're going to see official events and community run events going side by side. There was some of that before, but I think we're going to see even more of it now because these online communities have grown and become really vital for people. So anyway, so that's what people mean when they talk about a dead game. They mean there's no new content coming out, there's no regular place you can go and play with people, there's no strong competitive scene, and that's what makes it dead. Okay, so let's talk about how things die. Fantasy Flight Games has a history of games dying. think a lot of publishers do, but Fantasy Flight Games specifically has a history of games that have a competitive scene and then die. And yeah, they're definitely not alone in that. Uh, I think of a game like Hero Clicks that I think has gone up and down over time. Magic has had a really consistent community for decades, and Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh are other games that have had just a really consistent competitive community for a really long time. But if you follow the board game space, if you follow um, if you follow podcasts or vlogs like the Covenant Cast, or there are others out there that discuss these games, there are plenty of other publishers that have competitive games that come on the scene and then eventually go dark and stop producing new content. Some that do that pretty quickly, even ones that are really promising and fun. So definitely not unique to FFG, but I feel, and I know a lot of other people feel like, oh, FFG has a history, probably because they produce such really fun games, and so you get into these games, you want them to just be vital, be vibrant forever, and when it doesn't happen, it's disappointing and it sticks with you. So, yeah, so they definitely do have a history, and let's talk about why some of these happen. So, one of the reasons that games can die under their own weight is because of barriers to entry. The first Game of Thrones card game had this problem, and they ended up producing a core set 2.0. They threw everything out and said, okay, let's do a 2.0 version of this that that then didn't stick around for as long as the first one had. And from what I hear, I wasn't involved in that game, but I know a lot of people felt like, oh, it's just way too hard for a new player to get in. This picture here is of Legend of the Five Rings, the card game, and I have not played that game. I read about it when it first came out. I was kind of interested, but I just didn't have room in my life at the time. I was a Netrunner, and man, I just look at that and there's just so much going on. And I love big rule sets, but it just seems so complicated to me. I know the games last pretty long, and it just seems daunting to me to get involved. Now that game just got discontinued. They're going to stop producing new products for it. So, um, is that part of why it happened? Because they couldn't get new players to come in because, oh, here, just go buy 4 years worth of content in order to catch up and be competitive? I don't know, but I know that does factor in for some people. Netrunner had a problem like this as well, and they started to try to introduce rotation to get there. The game got discontinued, I think, for other reasons, right around the time rotation became a really strong factor. So, um, so I think they actually had a pretty good plan to keep that going, and it just didn't work out because of other reasons. But yeah, it once you have, okay, if you need to be competitive, you need to buy this entire back catalog and need to understand all this much about the meta. It's very daunting. Yeah, longer play times, and even having to have a wide card knowledge. Even if you say, okay, here, just do this deck archetype and run with this for a while, and it'll be fine. It can still be difficult if someone feels like, okay, but I'm going to face so much crazy stuff. So this can be a factor why it's difficult to get new players involved. And if you're not getting new players involved and you have a few people leaving at a time, then over time you're just going to peter out. There's not going to be a market. And when there's not a market, the publisher's going to stop making the game. That's just how it works. So how do you fix this? Well, I think FFG has been trying out a lot of good ideas on this. One way I mentioned in regard to Netrunner is rotation, where you say, okay, older sets are no longer allowed in certain formats. Magic is a great example of this, where they've been doing this for decades. They have a strong rotation schedule that is just very consistent. Another way to handle it is power creep. If you just make the new stuff way stronger than the old stuff, then you don't have to rotate. It naturally happens. But Magic's done a good job of having a solid rotation schedule, and as far as I understand, not having a problem with power creep. Um, and then I have some stuff here from Marvel Champions and Arkham Horror, which are cooperative games, but they have cool things going on where for Marvel Champions, every time they release a hero, that hero comes in a package with a full deck that you can just use. So if you have a friend that has the game that has the scenarios and just want to sit down and play with a hero that you're excited about. You just buy that hero and sit down and play, and you have a deck that's ready to go. You don't have to think too much. And so for Arkham Horror, which has a pretty deep catalog, they have done something like this where they have ready-made investigator decks that you can buy, play, and there's enough new content in there that as somebody who is a collector, I will probably buy those, even though I'm into the game. I have a big catalog. So and for KeyForge, have these self-contained decks where it's just okay, go buy this and you're good. You can just sit down. For Magic, they have formats like Sealed, which helps with this. You have and from my understanding, and I haven't played Magic in a while now, but from my understanding is that there are formats now where you get a deck that is made and has some amount of balance in it, that you wouldn't play for Constructed, but is fun to just sit down and play. So yeah, and I think KeyForge is really good here. The one thing I worry about with KeyForge in regard to barrier to entry is as there become more and more rules, and because older sets will stay viable or will stay legal, the set of things you might face becomes very deep. But I think that's kind of okay if you can just sit down and things are moderately balanced, or relatively balanced. Sit down, you can play and not care too much. KeyForge also doesn't have strong like bluffing elements or things like that. KeyForge had a lot of bluffing, a lot of this could be one of these 20 things, and what do you might make a different decision based on what you think it is, and it's face down, and you really needed to know the whole card pool. But that's not so true with. I mean, it helps, but it's not necessary in the same way. So yeah, so I think KeyForge doesn't have a big problem here. And they're even, again, sort of using concepts from KeyForge in other games to lower their barrier to entry, and other publishers are picking up on it. Okay, another reason that games end up dead is licensing, and this could be a situation where, well, first of all, to explain what I mean by licensing, licensing is where you take intellectual property that belongs to some other company and you include it in your game and you ask that company for permission. They'll say, okay, well, you pay us this amount. Okay, we'll pay you that, and then you get to use their content. Well, right off the bat, that is going to reduce your profit, right? Because you have these development costs, you have production costs, and some of that is going to this other company that isn't making the game. All they have is the intellectual property. Oftentimes they'll provide art assets, but that probably means they're cutting further into your profits. So yeah, so you are stuck in that situation where your profit margins are just going to be lower than if you didn't have to pay those licensing. Like if you were doing something that was public domain. Unmatched is a great example of this. They have some some packages that they release that are public domain, and some that have licensed characters in them. And for the licensed characters, they actually have a higher price point, and I think they sell them through a different publisher. They have two publishers working together for that one. So um, and it costs something like $5 more for a box of 4 characters. So it really can add up, and it cuts into the profits price point, which is going to cut out some players. In addition to that, which is just it's like okay, now you're running with weights on your ankles. In addition to that, there's a possibility that you just suddenly can't come to a deal anymore. And I have Netrunner up here, but Netrunner is a crazy situation because the original Netrunner card game, if I understand properly, licensed the lore and theme from Cyberpunk 2020, but was inventing a new card game mechanic. The FFG reboot of Netrunner, Android Netrunner, licensed the card game mechanics from Wizards of the Coast and the name Netrunner, but used their own internally developed intellectual property called Android. They have several other FFG has several other Android games. So um, so there it was kind of complicated, and in the end, uh, the game, they had a core 2.0. Things seemed to be going great. The player base was starting to grow again after a slump that I think had to do with barrier to entry, and suddenly they just stopped. It just got discontinued. They didn't have the license, and I don't know all the details to that. I someday would love for somebody to do a full dump of info about what happened there, but we'll just have to wait till we find out, and maybe we never will. But that game, I think, as far as I can tell, really died due to licensing issues. And it's kind of thematic that happened, and the community thematically said, "Well, get the corporations, we're going to do our own thing," which is pretty cool. But I haven't been playing it since then. Warhammer is an interesting example. FFG used to have a lot of Warhammer-based games, Warhammer and Warhammer 40K, and they had a situation where it seems like probably what happened is Games Workshop, who owns the Warhammer IP intellectual property, said, you're getting a little too big for your britches. We don't too much of a competitor to us now. We don't want you our intellectual property, and cut the license. Conquest was a game that died really, as far as I can tell, as a direct result of Games Workshop just saying we don't want you using our IP anymore. So yeah, so sometimes that's why a game dies, and it'd be really cool to see the mechanics get reworked and republished, but uh, whether that happens is always, who knows. So how do you solve that? Well, one way is you just make your own IP or you use the public domain. And so for KeyForge, FFG has used their has entirely invented their own IP. Now they do have some costs associated with that, right? They have to have writers and artists and all this sort of thing, but they have total control over it, and nobody can come in and say, "Oh, well, now you have to pay twice as much," or unless artistry just gets twice as, in which case all games are going to be affected. So, um, yeah, that's a great way around that problem. Okay, next problem that I want to bring up is production cost and complexity. And this is, I have Destiny on here for a reason. Although it's worth noting there are other games that are more complex too. But when you buy a board game, it typically will have little wooden or plastic pieces, sometimes in certain shapes. There's thick cardboard board sometimes, maybe some cards. But all those things are, add costs to produce. Cards are very inexpensive, relatively speaking. If you're just printing a bunch of cards, your production costs are going to be pretty low. Star Wars Destiny is a game that played like a card game, but then added in these dice components, these custom dice components, and and they had booster packs that each contained a single die. It messed with the rarity, ended up being important because all rare and above cards would have a die that comes with them, and each booster pack would have one rare or other card. But because of this distribution model, you can't get a second rare in there. No way. You can't have something crazy happen where let's make a common card with a die. You can't do that. So there's some constraints there. But ultimately, like they're printing these dice and putting them in booster boxes, which is something very few other companies are doing. They're packaging them with cards, which is also weird, and you end up with these booster packs that have this weird shape, and they have to be put in these big boxes. And so it just means that their economy of scale is going to be way off compared to a game like KeyForge, where it's just print a bunch of cards and stick them in a package. So, and then on top of that, you have the licensing costs. So, really, they I think for Destiny they needed the community to be bigger in order to justify all that extra overhead. Um, and and I will say this is something I don't have a separate slide for, but distribution issues. with Destiny also were a big problem. And I don't know how much of this was due to this being custom stuff they're manufacturing or what, but for whatever reason, FFG was just wildly inconsistent about when Destiny reached stores and how much would reach stores. And they've had some problems with KeyForge, but up until COVID, they were doing really well. And even since, they've done a pretty good job of communicating. The mass mutation release got messed up pretty hard by COVID, but that's pretty understandable. Um, so yeah, anytime you're adding all this custom stuff, it just makes things complicated, more expensive, uh, less reliable, and it's a big thing. So okay. And the last thing I want to address are design limitations. It's possible that for some games, like you just run out of ideas. Um, I put the question, is this real? Because I think there's kind of a sliding scale here where if you were willing to hire the right people or pay enough money, you probably find somebody who would come up with some new design feature to add to the game, some place to take it. Um, but uh, that becomes a pros and cons thing, right? Where you really have the bringing in the money to justify spending more on design. So this is a real problem, but it tends to be kind of a trade-off rather than just like there's no other place to take the game. And like I said earlier, there are some examples of games that have been around for decades and are good examples of not letting this stop them. But I think it is a real possibility. Um, and there's a bit of a cycle here, right? If we have a vibrant player base buying lots of copies of the game, then the company has more money to pump into uh, resources to develop the game, which means they're going to produce a better game, which means more people want to get involved. Um, this is where a major design misstep, taking it in a direction or something like that, could really hurt the game and put it in a negative spiral. But this can also be a positive spiral. So yeah, so this I think is really the thing that's most likely to take KeyForge down. If you look at those other categories, um, it's just the production costs relative to other things that are out there. It seems to me like it just should be super low. Um, I would guess it costs them much less to print a deck than the MSRP. Um, much less. Uh, and it's their own IP, and um, yeah. So really, the question is just, are they going to keep producing a good, fun product that people want to buy, that people want to play competitively? And I think if so, as long as because of the costs being relatively low, the barrier for what size the community has to be to sustain the game is also relatively low. And so until they hit a point where, okay, there's no other place to take it, or they do something stupid and we all walk away, I think KeyForge is pretty much around to stay. Now, the last thing I wanted to say here, and I don't have a slide for this either, is I think there are some interesting design things in KeyForge that haven't been in other games, right? Like the idea of a unique deck and even the head-to-head, but it's a race, not a fight. Um, and it's a little surprising to me that there aren't more examples of competitors popping up trying out some of those ideas, especially with regard to deck generation. It's a little surprising to me that there's not more of that out there, and people think, okay, what if we made a game like that had a different theme, different mechanics, but still algorithmically generated decks, and where we really push the design limits because people can't deck build. I'd love to see somebody else try that, and there's no reason another project like that couldn't be successful. So, if that's something we're interested in, you should go try to make something that would this fun and this engaging with that sort of constraint on it. So yeah, so all that to say, I really think KeyForge is around to stay for a good long while. I certainly hope so, but I don't think just wishful thinking. I think it really doesn't have a lot of the things dragging it down that some other games have, or the same risks that other games had. So I think we'll have it for a long time. Um, but that's it. Those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are in response, and I hope that you will keep on enjoying the game, that you'll get involved in playing online if you're not already, and that hopefully you'll be able to get together in person soon and get out and forge some keys. Thanks.